You're listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by Nicola Spurling on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples.
Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling, and today I'm joined by transgender city councillor and chair of Inclusion, Equity, Diversity, and Access Commission, Ashley Shade. Thank you for joining the podcast. Can you introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me. As you said, my name is Ashley Shade. I'm a city councilor in North Adams, Massachusetts, where I serve as the vice president of the city council and also serve as a co-chair of our Inclusivity, Diversity, Equity, and Access. So we call IDEA Commission. As everybody knows, what's happening in the United States right now is a bit scary for transgender people and for anyone involved in any kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And it's a little unsettling, and I'm sure most of your audience would agree with that.
I think most of our audience would, and that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So to start with, what is it like being trans in the US right now, as access to healthcare, sports, washrooms, and more are being legislated away?
It's different for everybody depending on what states they live in, and that shouldn't be the case. All Americans should have access to services. All Americans should be treated with dignity and respect, irregardless of what adjective comes before their gender. So it's a scary time right now. A lot of people are very uneasy. A lot of people are afraid, and a lot of people are worried, and they should be worried. I live in a state in Massachusetts where we have constitutional protections in our state constitution. So our state has more built-in protections against what's going on. And one thing I want to remind everyone is an executive order is not a law. Congress makes laws. The president can sign or veto them. But an executive order is not a law. It's a policy directive. And what that means is that it is not the law. The law is the law. And so many of the rulings that he's tried to make happen through executive order are being stopped by courts, are being blocked, are being found unconstitutional. And I do believe that will continue.
And I hope it does continue. And you talk about how there's this difference between, the states, I guess, in terms of how they treat trans people or how they approach a variety of different issues. Do you
Yeah.
find that a majority of elected officials actually have strong opinions about trans people? Or are they just kind of too afraid to speak out against their party, and so they're towing the party line, and that's how these things are coming to fruition?
I would say maybe there's some, but from the Republican side of things, nobody's going to go against Trump. He
Right.
has too much wealth and power accumulated, and nobody wants Elon Musk's money in their reelection campaigns. And so they're very going to tread extremely lightly when it comes to standing up to Trump. As a matter of fact, the only Republican who has stood up to Trump through his nomination process, of all people, was Mitch McConnell,
Not
who was
someone
a
you would expect.
former Senate Speaker who voted against some of Trump's appointment picks, and that's because there's questions about if he's actually living or not, or just a turtle shell. But
Right.
in reality, he's at that point. He's not running for reelection. He has nothing to lose.
Mhm.
So for people who aren't going to run for reelection, it makes it easier for them to be bold and speak out. But also, most people are also fearing retaliation and retribution for speaking out or being anti-party or not towing the party line. And unfortunately, the Democratic response, while getting better, was very slow out of the gate, even though they knew that this was going to happen because he told everyone exactly what he was going to do.
Right. I started off with these questions about trans people because we are both trans, and I think that that's a really hot topic at the moment as well. But in that vein, DEI is also something that's been under attack lately, and that affects people a little bit more broadly. And it seems like there's this misconception that DEI runs counter to meritocracy. And in fact, it was implemented because underqualified people were being given more opportunities than qualified minorities. So it's actually the exact opposite. So why do you think that this misconception persists?
Because it's the way the conversation has been framed. The hardline conservatives have used anti-DEI messaging to show, oh, well, what this means is we're just going to give somebody a job because they're different. In actuality, what it means is we're going to look at people who are different to make sure that they have the opportunity to get a job if they have the skills and qualifications.
Right.
There's many great examples of that, whether it be in military service, whether it be in Trump's FAA, which right now is falling apart, and we have plane crashes happening every other day.
Yeah.
Um,
Why are there so many videos of plane crashes lately?
I don't know, but the one more recent one was in Toronto, right, or in Canada, that landed
Well,
in.
yeah, we're actually, that's a funny thing is that that's almost a sense of pride in Canada because you look to the US and you see Boeing planes just kind of falling apart. These are US made planes. And then you see this Bombardier plane in Canada that flips upside down, crashes at 200 kilometers an hour, stays fully intact, and everyone survives. And you kind of feel this sense of, I guess, patriotism, and you see oh, Canadian-made things are better than American-made things, and it reinforces this idea that our boycott against American goods is a good thing, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But is there anything else that you wanted to talk about on the DEI front? Because I sort of cut you off there.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad to look at things and the way things are being framed. It's like this anti, if you're not exactly like us, you are the enemy approach.
Right.
And you see that in the language of these executive orders. The executive order to ban people in the military, calling them dishonorable people for and unfit to serve. An executive order where he essentially calls people who do DEI as woke, essentially unqualified, uneducated people who don't have the skills to do the work that they were hired for. DEI is all about, and this is why in our city we have an IDEA, an idea commission, is what we call it.
Hmm.
Um, the A is so important to the conversation, the access. DEI is about opening up access and allowing people who are different an opportunity to showcase their skills when they normally wouldn't get that opportunity to do so in the first place, specifically because they are different.
Right.
And that's so important. And I always have come from the philosophy that a government represents all of its people.
It
And I
should.
think the government is supposed to represent everybody. An
Hmm.
elected official represents all of their constituents, not just the ones that voted for them. An elected official serves the public and the community. They don't force the community to serve them. And that's the situation we're in right now.
Mhm. And what are your thoughts about DEI sort of as it relates to that elected official aspect? I know we have conversations here where we talk about how we want our elected officials to be reflective of the society that they govern. And a lot of the times that's not the case. We end up with a lot of older white cis men in government. Is that something that's a hot topic in the States, or do people stay away from that because there's such an attack on DEI?
I think in every state you'll find initiatives still happening. I think in more liberal states, it's something that is a point of pride to have more diversity among our elected officials. Here in my city, I'm the first trans person to get elected, and even in the county, the area of my state. But one thing that the Idea Commission does for my city is we actually, as a commission, create trainings and present them to our elected officials so that they can better understand how their decision making might affect marginalized populations and communities that they never even thought, about how voting on this one thing or having a discussion on this one thing without looking at it through the scope of DEI, you essentially don't see how it might affect people of other communities. And that's really important in governing. The decisions you make should reflect everyone in the community, not just one group.
Right. And I want to sort of pivot a little bit at this point. And I know that this isn't really something that's being done at your level of government so much. But what do you think about the threats of tariffs and annexation that are being made against Canada? I think this is sort of a unique opportunity to have a US politician talking to someone who's involved in Canadian politics, and maybe we can bridge some divides here. So what
Yeah.
do you think about this? And also, what do you think about Trump referring to our prime minister as a governor?
Well, Trump is also referring to himself as a king, which to me is treason and impeachable. And and an impeachable offense. So
Right, I thought
um,
the US left the monarchy.
we we do not like monarchs. Monarchs get the guillotine, and that's how it should be. But I would say that tariffs are a terrible, terrible thing. Tariffs are the antithesis to fair trade and free trade. Tariffs only serve to raise costs, make it more difficult for consumers, and take money out of your pocket. Tariffs don't do good for the people. And there's a reason why the last time the United States government had major tariffs back in the 1920s, it led to a Great Depression.
Mhm.
Uh, the last time a tariff dominated tax policy was the policy, it led to huge, terrible financial consequences for the country and for everyone. So I'm very anti-tariffs as far as Canada being the 51st state. Um, if you wanted to join us, I would say welcome. I would hope right now that you don't.
I don't think there's much
And
appetite for that.
I would tell you right now, there are some of our states that would be more than willing to say, "Hey, please welcome us instead."
Yeah. Actually,
And
the head of one of our parties, the Green Party of Canada, made an incredible speech about bringing certain states into Canada as additional provinces, and I thought that was quite a funny response to Donald Trump.
yeah, I think the states up here in New England and maybe New York and the West Coast states would maybe even welcome that,
Mhm.
depending on where things go with this administration and how bad it gets. So
Right. We do have free healthcare.
that is a beautiful thing. I mean, Massachusetts, we probably have the best healthcare system in the country out of every state. We're really lucky and fortunate for that. Our system works a little differently than many other states. We were the first state to, implement statewide coverage for people and have a system like that to make sure that everybody could be insured.
Right.
Um, so we are more advanced in that way, and we're also very advanced in education. We have great educational institutions, and um, but in all seriousness, the audacity of any sovereign government to say we're going to steal your territory or we're going to force people to do things the way we want them to do is absolutely insane and inappropriate and needs to be fought at every step of the language. Don't take it as a joke. This guy doesn't joke around. He's
Mhm.
not that intelligent to joke around. He means what he's saying, which is why you need to take it seriously and you need to show up and stand out and speak up because bullies will always back down when enough people gather together and slap them in the face.
Yeah. Well, and I think we kind of did see that as well. There was these threats of tariffs against Canada, for instance, if we didn't have a certain amount of funding going towards the border security, right? And we had, or the Prime Minister of Canada had already made a promise to put that funding in place, and so he just reiterated the same promise that he'd made months prior, and Trump basically took it as a win. He folded and didn't keep
But
going with those threats. And I mean, it's not the end, I don't think by any means. And our prime minister has been pretty clear about the fact that he no longer thinks Trump is joking. I think he thought it was a joke at first, and then he has since realized this isn't someone who's joking around about this, and we do need to take this seriously. We need to figure out how to push back. And with that in mind, I think Canadians know that we have a significant amount of leverage in terms of the exports that we send to the US, or using our boycotts to highlight our buying power, divesting of investments in the US, withholding our travel dollars, and controlling a lot of the USA's energy and water needs as well. Do you think that people in the US are aware of how reliant they are on Canada, or is there this sentiment that Canada needs the US a lot more than you need us?
I think the sentiment is going to be that you need us more than we need you. But
Mhm.
people are quickly realizing, give you an example. Alabama right now, the state of Alabama had a grant program in place that helped lower heating costs for people. And one of Trump's executive orders essentially canceled that grant out. So now everybody just got charged with a bunch of a surcharge tax fee from their utility company, their gas company, for heating costs. And
Great.
if tariffs go into place on things like fuel and heating, and especially in the brutal winter that we're having this year, and this winter cold is reaching to our southern states, um, reaching to the heart of country. Um, when they feel that and they get hit by that, if they get hit with the rising costs as well, I think eventually it could turn the tide. And we are seeing some people, especially federal workers who supported Trump, who are now on the unemployment line and losing their jobs and their
Yeah.
homes, slowly start to be like, well, I thought you were going to do it to them, not me. What are you doing? Why are you attacking me? I voted for you. So I think the tide will slowly turn. There's always going to be certain people who are always going to be stuck on the Trump train, and you can't argue with people who don't understand reason, because reason was never the reason that they supported Trump to begin with. It
Right.
wasn't logic. It was this captivation of nationalism, and nationalism is the most dangerous threat to any democracy. And unfortunately, too many people here have fallen for it, and they will find out it's going to be costly. It's going to cause suffering, and a whole generation of children are going to be far worse off because of this election.
And I mean, with that in mind, like, I wonder, how does the country rebuild after something like this, right? It seems like Trump is making a lot of changes, has the power to make a lot of changes that are going to really impact the country for many years to come. So, how do you go about, I guess, reversing that or mitigating that risk? Maybe in 2 years, he'll have a little bit less power, but it seems like he's really on this crash course of trying to accomplish as much as possible, and the things he's accomplishing are not good.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's, me personally, how would I combat this? First, I would hope that a different political party takes power in 2 years when the House elections happen. In that instance, and hopefully even the Senate, which would give the power of impeachment actual teeth and the ability to remove the president, because the people that he's putting in place in power in different places, they're never going to make a move against him. And that's what's scary. That's the true test. And we have to ask ourselves, and there's going to be a legitimate question: will there be a peaceful transfer of power in the next presidential election?
Mhm.
The answer right now is no. I
No.
don't believe it will be.
Well, they don't have a
And
history of it.
we don't have the history of it, but it's coming. And so there's so much that needs to be done through Congress and the legislature to rein in the power of the executive branch. The executive branch was never supposed to have this kind of power, and it's disturbing for any party, whether it's Republicans, Democrats, or independents, or any other party. It's disturbing for a leader in a democracy to believe that they have the power to control everything, that
Mhm.
they can write an executive order that says, I am the law, and what I say is the law. And that's essentially what he just did. And for him to think that that's actually constitutional, that that's within his duties or powers of or scope, and the fact that his own party isn't fighting tooth and nail to say no, you can't do that. Well, what happens when the opposite party takes control?
Mhm.
You see the same kind of backlash, but in a totally opposite direction. How can we allow that? We won't survive like that. And it's disturbing to think about.
Mhm.
I do have hope. I do have hope that things can be slowed down in the courts, which they are. They are being slowed down in the courts. Many decisions are being blocked up by courts. They are being ruled unconstitutional because they are. And they'll go through the lengthy legal process. And I do hope that a new political party comes into power in 2 years that can rein in the executive powers that are being used, and really change laws to ensure that this can never, ever happen again.
And is that something that you see as being possible within your political system? Because it seems like the president is given a massive amount of power that is sort of outrageous looking at it from an outsider's perspective here in Canada, right? Where to have the ability to pardon all of these people and to never really be held accountable by the courts, it just feels like the president can get away with anything. But I know that there is some recourse there. I just feel like it seems as though this two-party system, this first past the post system that we also have, but not to the same degree, it creates this division, and it seems like the country is just becoming more and more divided as time goes on. Is that something that is repairable within that current system, or does the entire system have to change for that to happen?
Well, the two-party system is the only system that can allow this to happen, really. It's because there's a lack of coalition building that this is allowed to happen, that this takes place. So I think there's major reforms that need to be made to our elections and to our party structures. Absolutely. I also think that, presidential pardons have always been a presidential power, and that's that. But as far as, the executive orders again are not laws. They're policy dictates. Um, it doesn't make them constitutional. As a matter of fact, most of them are not.
Mhm,
The Supreme Court's ruling about immunity for presidents, no individual person was ever supposed to have immunity
mhm.
uh, from obeying the law. And that is disturbing that that happened, and it's unjustified. And I do hope that one day when the Supreme Court has different people in place, that that can be changed, or that Congress grows a pair and challenges the presidential authority and passes laws to rein in that power. Because again, Congress writes laws, not the president.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I kind of find wild about this current situation is that in the past there was this, I guess, sense of decorum that
Mhm.
presidents would have, whether they were the Republicans or the Democrats. There were these expectations that were placed upon the presidents where they were going to profit off of the job, for instance. And
Mhm.
now we're seeing the president go down the same path as Hawk to a girl, right?
Yeah.
Where they're creating these, he created this meme coin and engaged in a pump and dump scheme essentially, where
Mhm.
he's making a massive amounts of money off of his status as the president, and blatantly so. No one's calling him on it. No one is really doing anything to shut it down. And how did we get to a place where that's something that a president can just get away with these days as well?
I don't know. How did we get here?
Just
Did
ridiculous, right? I mean, you can just laugh at.
this is supposed to be an alternate timeline that could never ever happen, and here it is.
Mhm.
Um, where's the time stone when we need it, right? But
Right.
seriously, when it comes to Trump, he's just unpredictable, and he believes he can do anything he wants. He believes he has the power to do anything he wants. I think one of the reasons many people aren't speaking out against him on this is because the people that bought into his cryptocurrency are his own supporters, and they're getting hurt by it. So, the Democratic Party is going to be like, "Oh, go ahead, keep hurting your people. Let's screw them over. Let's see what they." But these same people are still staying loyal. So it's insane how so many people are loyal to someone who doesn't give a damn about them.
Right. And I mean, he's in his second term, he can't run again, so it's almost like it doesn't matter to him if he's screwing over his supporters because 'cause they're not gonna vote for him next time around, they have to choose a different candidate entirely. Or am I misinterpreting that in some way?
So legally, yes, that is true. Even though the Republicans are trying to pass a constitutional amendment to allow him to run for a third term, which won't happen because even if it passed Congress and the president signed it, it would still have to be ratified by 38 states to repeal the old amendment that limits presidents to two terms.
Right.
And there's no way in hell that 38 states are going to support that.
Mhm.
Um, at the same time, it's and this is why I said in the beginning there could be a constitutional crisis. I could foresee a situation where Trump decides I'm not giving up power. I don't care who is elected. I'm staying president. Then what
Mhm.
happens?
Right. And I mean, I don't want to keep focusing too much on Trump. I think people are probably pretty tired of hearing about Trump over and over again.
Aren't
But I
they?
do want to talk about how this relates to Canada-US relations. And we're seeing a lot of the same rhetoric that is pushed by the Republicans, mirrored by our Conservative Party here in Canada. Do you think that this is, kind of the conspiracy theory, I guess, as it were, some sort of collusion to get a government that's sympathetic in power in Canada, and so they're sharing these sort of messages, I guess? This is a question that I was actually asked to ask you. Or do you think that this is simply a case of politicians mimicking tactics that they see working elsewhere, which we know happens all the time?
I think it's a combination of both. I mean, you see it right now with Germany and what's going on over there. They're going to have an election in very soon, coming up. They have an extreme far right party that is cozying up. You saw JD Vance go over to Germany and visit the leader of this far right party and refuse to meet the current chancellor of Germany, but
Hmm.
goes and meets the leader of the far right movement. You see Elon Musk trying to insert his wealth into politics in every country, and it's essentially a far right nationalistic movement that's happening globally. I think a lot of it is backlash to COVID. I think, and lockdowns and mandates and people feeling trapped by that situation and how governments handled that. But I think another part of it is a counterculture focused messaging by conservatives and Republicans who essentially have a very simple message for people who are hurting, and that's, well, let's hurt them back.
Right.
You're hurting, so we're going to hurt people on your behalf.
Which is a sad concept.
It is a very sad concept because instead of tearing people down to feel better, we should be lifting people up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what this podcast is all about, is how do we support those people as opposed to tearing them down?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, what we're seeing, in Canada with your government and your elections, there was a backlash to your prime minister because over the past few years, things have gotten worse.
Mhm.
He has made some pretty public and glaring mistakes in how he's made decisions and kind of used his once extremely popular image to kind of do things that were unpopular and do
Mhm.
things, he thought, again, and I think this becomes true of many politicians when they get into power, um, that their power means that they can kind of push things through even when the people don't want it.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of how he started as prime minister too. He was elected on this promise of electoral reform. He
Mhm.
said, "If you elect me, it's the last time you're ever going to have to hold your nose and vote for someone you don't like because I'm going to implement electoral reform. You'll be able to vote for the party you want to vote for. That vote's going to actually mean something instead of having to vote strategically." And as soon as he got all of this support from people who wanted to see that, he took that as, wow, I'm really popular, so maybe I won't actually do this thing. And that pissed a lot of people off, but not enough that he wasn't able to continue to get elected. He just lost some popularity. And now he's at a point where enough other things have gone wrong that he's lost that popularity even more. I think the one saving grace that we have here is that people will look to the US and say, we don't want that. And so typically, what happens is when there's a conservative government in the US, we will move to the left in Canada in response to that. And we're starting to see that. And then we're also starting to see someone named Mark Carney, I don't know if you're aware, is running for the Liberal leadership in Canada as well. And he's viewed as a bit more of an outsider. So whereas some of the other candidates come from within the party and they're going to be, brushed with the same brush as Trudeau was, he's able to maybe win back some support on that side. And maybe we'll end up with a minority government, which is my personal favorite type of government. But you mentioned before this influence that billionaires have, that Elon Musk has. And I'm curious to know your thoughts around that. I think, we have Elon Musk with X or Twitter, who is using his influence on this platform to really influence elections around the world at this point. We
Mhm.
have Jeff Bezos now owning one of the Washington Post, a media outlet. And recently I saw an article about how he was removing ads that were critical of Trump from the Washington Post. So when you have these billionaires that are able to just buy influence, buy off government, that's going to change the landscape of not just the US, but the world at large eventually if that goes unchecked. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that? Are there ways that that can be prevented from happening, or is that just our destiny is that billionaires are going to become more and more the people who run the world?
Money buys influence and power, and no escaping that. Um,
And
the
that's more so now because we're seeing more and more wealth gaps, right? The richer are getting richer, and so that's just getting amplified, it seems.
And the harsh reality is that rich people are always going to do everything in their power to consolidate their power and to gain more influence and control.
Hmm.
It's what happens to people who are power hungry, and the people who tend to be the wealthiest tend to be power hungry.
Yeah.
Um, it's an unfortunate side effect of things. Me personally, I think three things need to happen in the United States to help curb that. The first is that Citizens United needs to be overturned, and we need to have election laws in place that limit the amount of money that can be spent by candidates. Billions of dollars on a presidential race on advertisements that nobody wants to see. We do we don't wanna see this every 10 minutes, but here we are seeing these presidential ads and these candidate ads, and they're annoying as hell, and
Hmm.
they don't help anybody, and most of them are filled with lies and misinformation on every party, and it's disturbing, and it's not how it was designed, it's not how it was ever intended to be. Um,
And so you
but
don't have donation limits, just to sort of clarify that. Is that right?
there are.
There are donation limits.
There are donation limits to give money to people directly.
Hmm.
So, for example, as an individual in a federal race, I believe that number has gone up to, I think it's maybe 6,000. But
Okay.
like, what we do have is also because of the Citizens United ruling, there are things called super PACs. And super PACs, anybody can donate as much money as they want to a super PAC, and it can be done anonymously.
Oh.
And a super PAC can then run ads to discredit another candidate or to attack people or to support a candidate, so long as they aren't directly working with the candidate. So what you've seen is a bunch of super PACs pop up, and that's why you'll see a lot of the political ads that are ran here. They'll say paid for by America First PAC or whatever,
Hmm.
rather than the campaign of Donald Trump. And it's because it's a PAC working to spread that same message that isn't legally allowed to coordinate with the campaign, but can raise as much money as they want from whoever's willing to give it and not have to even disclose who's giving the money.
Right. And I guess you can have someone who's just paying to put a message out themselves. Like I'm sure Elon Musk, using
Exactly.
his $44 billion to buy Twitter and then put out whatever messages he wants doesn't fall under election advertising, right?
Yeah, social media, there's no regulations on that kind of thing. But also Elon Musk spent over $200 million in the last cycle putting out ads. He has his own pack that he puts
Right.
money into to do all of these things. And he was giving out money for people to register to vote.
Yeah,
Um,
I heard
to
about
make
that.
people checks in Pennsylvania, and so this is not how elections are supposed to happen. This is absolutely a disturbing trend in American politics. It needs to change. And I would hope that other nations see what's happened here and create their own laws to make sure it can't happen there.
Hmm. And I mean, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the gun problem as well, because that's something that we also find quite strange in Canada, looking down at the U.S. and seeing this obsession with guns. And I think there's this understanding that yes, you have the Second Amendment. Yes, it's sort of this right to be able to have these weapons, but also it's being really misused in a lot of ways. And we're seeing that there doesn't seem to be a lot of pushback when politicians want to infringe on the First Amendment. But when it comes to infringing on the Second Amendment for any reason, like whether it's just saying someone needs to go through training if they have a mental health problem and they want to have a gun or something along those lines. Like, just really basic things that there's this huge pushback. The NRA is getting involved and they're super well funded. When you have an issue like this, where tons of kids are dying at the hands of guns, it seems strange, and John Stewart pointed this out, that
Mhm.
the right is focusing on drag shows and the harm that that might have on kids when there's no evidence that that actually harms kids. And then they seem to have absolutely no issue with shooters coming into schools and killing tons of kids. Or they'll claim that, oh, it's sad thoughts and prayers, but they really do nothing to stop it. What can you maybe help us in Canada to understand that mentality of just backing support for guns to that degree?
Yeah. So America was founded on the principle that if you read the Declaration of Independence, the idea that if a government becomes tyrannical, the people have a right, and not only have a right to, but ought to take up arms against the tyrannical government and institute a new form of government,
Mhm.
which is what we should do right now. But I digress. Um, with that, also is this idea that people should have the ability to protect themselves, their property, and their loved ones from danger. And I don't think anybody would say that that's a bad thing. Now, where things get out of control is things that should be common sense are fought against tooth and nail. Things that should be, when it comes to guns and children, I don't think anybody thinks a child should be able to go into school and murder people. But
I would hope not.
you have a I would hope not as well. And it's sad, and you pointed out John Stewart, so I'll point him out as well, as he pointed out to a member of Congress in an interview a few years ago. The number one cause of death for minors in the United States is being murdered by
Right.
guns. It's the leading cause of death for children in the
Yeah.
United States is being murdered by guns. Part of that is a culture, and here's the thing, we went, I don't know, 150, 200 years before this became a problem. Why? I think there's 2 reasons why. One is there's a taboo about guns, that guns are so evil and nobody should ever have or see one. And I think that's wrong in a culture that has so many guns. Guns would be very difficult to get rid of because there are more guns in America than there are Americans.
Right.
It's also that reason of America being so well armed that no other country would ever want to invade America. Because not only do you have to deal with the most powerful military in the world, you've got to deal with a civilian population that is very well armed that would also fight back. And I think
Mhm.
that scares, a lot of countries, well, that and the oceans, but I think that scares people more than people give it credit for. To me, a gun is a tool, and a gun is something that should never be taken lightly. Well, two problems that we've run into going back to that, because I got off course. The first one is back in before up until the 50s and 60s, um, you would take gun safety classes at school. You would learn how to properly use a firearm. There wasn't a taboo about it. People knew how dangerous they were and how they could kill people. I
Mhm.
think our culture, the second problem, there's this culture that doesn't value life anymore. We don't place the same emphasis and value around other human beings being human beings and valuing every human's sovereignty and dignity and respect for life that we once had in this nation. And so, because of that, more people lash out using guns, especially younger people, because they haven't been taught the value of life. They haven't been taught to take care of people rather than hurt people. So there's this cultural piece that is teaching children, and even right now, we're teaching children to hate other children. We're teaching children that it's okay to discriminate against other people that aren't like you, that it's okay to hurt them, that you should hurt them because they're different.
Mhm.
And when you're teaching children to hurt other people, oh, what's the easiest way to hurt people? Kill them.
Right.
That works really well. So that culture and mindset is so far off of what it used to be in America that it has become such a more dangerous thing than it ever was before. School shootings were not a problem until 25, 30 years ago in the
Mm.
same way that they are now. And again, a big part of that is culture. A big part of that is the taboo about guns and training and understanding what a gun is and that it's a tool that needs to be respected. Just like a kitchen knife and a chef's knife is a tool that needs to be respected.
Mhm.
Um, I think there's also this idea of blaming guns for criminal actions, but it's people that are responsible. And
Mhm.
so I think there are a lot of people who would be okay with laws that say if you're going through mental health crisis or have a certain particular issue, you probably shouldn't have a gun. And I think those kinds of things are common sense. If you have a felony conviction for violent crimes, you shouldn't own a gun.
Mhm.
These are common sense type things that the majority of Americans are actually on board with, but lobbies don't want to allow any kind of reform because they feel like once one reform starts, it allows the floodgates to open for all reform. And I think
Yeah.
they fear that the most. And there's a hard, stringent group of people who wish that there were no guns at all. And I don't think that's sustainable or something that should happen because, again, there are so many guns already that people will say, you could put there are laws in place. Schools are gun-free zones, right? Doesn't stop someone from walking into a school and shooting people. So unfortunately, having those kind of rules doesn't help people protect themselves from the people who are going to violate those rules. Owning a gun is a very personal decision. It's one that shouldn't be taken lightly. It's one for responsible people who treat it with the utmost respect and dignity that it should be treated with, and it's for people who respect the dignity and sanctity of life. That is so important to respect other people's well-being. So I it's a situation where you ask a lot of other people, and they're going to say guns are terrible and they shouldn't exist. Personally, as a trans person, as somebody who is under attack by my government, by the federal administration, I want access to any tool I deem necessary to keep myself safe.
Mm.
There are people out there who send me hate messages and send me insults and threaten me, and I'd like to be able to protect myself in any way possible, um, because I believe that I should have that right to do so. And that's the other side of it. Gun control was never a thing in the United States until after slavery.
Mm.
First gun control laws were initiated after the slaves were freed because they didn't want slaves to arm themselves and fight back. So, gun control has also always been used as a tool to harm marginalized and minority populations, to limit their ability to fight injustices and fight discrimination. If you had a million trans people show up in Washington tomorrow armed and ready to fight back, you would see a very different tune from this administration on dehumanizing trans people. And I think that's true of any marginalized group or group of people. And if enough people take up arms and get together, one thing I give the French credit for, they know how to revolt. They know how to fight back. They are not afraid to bring out their guillotines. And um, while I don't condone violence, and I'm not a violent person, when it comes down to it, if people are trying to harm and kill you, you should have every right to fight back and keep yourself safe. And again, I don't condone violence, but at the same time, I understand why people get to that point when it comes to governments and tyranny. And it's a scary situation because it's one that we should never have to have.
Right. Well, and I mean, I can sort of understand that sentiment, even though it's not something that we necessarily deal with too much in Canada because we don't have that excess of guns where people have guns everywhere, and you have to have that thought of, well, how am I going to defend myself against all of this? Um,
Huh?
but also, you talk about how guns are tools, just like a car is a tool, and you would go out and you'd
Yes.
get a driver's license, and you'd insure your car, you know, I don't see why that couldn't be the same case for a gun, for instance, to make sure that people go through proper training and that there's a registry of who owns what and you can kind of keep some level of control over that. And from my understanding, the Second
Some of
Amendment.
that does exist. It's not completely unexisting. Like, for example, in Massachusetts, to get a license to carry, a firearm, you do have to take a pistol training course. It's a full day course that you learn the rules and regulations, you learn about guns, you learn about how they are used, you fire a gun. And, it's a full course that you have to pay. You have to register with your police office. Your local police chief is the one who does your application, or a representative of the police force here in town. That does get sent to the state. The state of Massachusetts does have a registry for people who purchase firearms and like if you go into a gun shop, they do a background check on you right there. They register the gun in your name. They register what you purchase, and the state does have that information.
Mhm.
So, for example, if you have a license to carry and you were pulled over by the police department, when they run your identification, it'll also say that you have a license to carry, and police will know that. Just in a state like here in Massachusetts, that is a thing. Now, there are people that are able to go to other places and certain fairs and different kinds of gun shows and stuff, and they buy these weapons without registering anything, or they're just kind of randomly sold. There should be that kind of a process that I have in Massachusetts, I think is the appropriate process anywhere. That's to
Mhm.
ensure that responsibility. Owner's insurance does exist. It's not mandatory, but it does exist. And honestly, it mainly exists for people to fight lawsuits if they end up ever using their gun.
Right.
It's more of a protection on, I used my gun in self defense and now I'm being sued, and the gun
Mhm.
insurance provides that kind of legal defense and legal expertise to help you through that situation. So those kind of things do exist. But I completely agree that the system is broken. Everybody knows that it's broken. There are people who are always going to take advantage of broken systems. And unfortunately, there are powerful groups of people who don't want to change anything at all,
Mhm.
and there should be things that change. Now, on the flip side of that, we have a federal government right now that is being tyrannical. And if we had a national database of firearms owners, and if I were one, I would be terrified that the federal government would send armed people after me to try to hurt me. Um, and so that same thought process of doing it on that level can also be used against people. And as a member of a marginalized community, I've seen the government intentionally use these systems to harm marginalized communities. And that piece scares me. So, where do you find the balance? Is the question. Where do you find the protections to make sure that what systems are put in place that are supposed to help people aren't also not being used to hurt people? And
Mhm.
that's a fine balance and a fine line that we haven't found.
Yeah, and I mean, I know that gun laws sort of vary from state to state, so, I appreciate you, making that point clear, and my understanding is that the Second Amendment is, I guess, loosely based off of the well-armed militia in Switzerland, and this concept of you arm your population, and in the event of a war, you have the ability to mobilize your entire population to go to war and fight back to defend yourself. And there is also, differences between how the Second Amendment was worded and how those laws exist in Switzerland, in that it is shall not be infringed, right? That's not a thing that exists in Switzerland. And there's this kind of view that you need to rise up potentially against a tyrannical government. And I understand as a marginalized person that there is that fear of that happening. And at the same time, the people that will promote the Second Amendment the most seem to be the same people that are in support of funding the US military to the maximum extent. And
Yeah.
I wonder how you reconcile those two things, right? If you're saying, well, maybe one day I'm going to have to rise up against my government, why are you trying to make sure that your government is the most heavily armed government in existence? And also, why are you doing that when so many people within your country are suffering? There
I
seems to
agree.
be this sort of shifting of goalposts where people say, I don't want to support people in other countries before I support the homeless, but also I'm going to support our military before I support our homeless. Or I don't want people to get food stamps, and I don't want free health care, but yet I'm okay with sending all this money to the military instead. I don't get that mentality either. Is that something you can shed some light on?
I don't get it either. It's
Okay.
terrible. I completely agree with everything you're saying. You know, Eisenhower warned in his farewell address back in the 50s of the military industrial complex and the power that it would gain. And he was right. He warned everybody. He was right. The military industrial complex has gained a lot of power and influence. Why? Because it has the money to gain power and influence. It uses that money to interfere in elections, which is why I don't think corporations should be allowed to donate to elections. I think, individual donors are the only people that should be able to donate to elections. And it should all be tracked and transparent. Unfortunately, it's not. And the system has become convoluted because people like to make exceptions where they can gain wealth and power. And
Hmm.
that's the system we have right now. It's very unfortunate. It's disturbing. It's not adequate, and it's not okay. It pains me to think about how so many resources are used in the name of defense while so many people are left to suffer here.
Hmm.
And the true reason behind that, the true reason behind everything that's going on in the United States right now, and the uprising of populism around the world, this populist messaging, people are afraid. People are scared. When you're scared, what do? You support the military. You support
Okay.
nationalism. You support populist messages. You support people who say, we're going to fight like hell and we're going to put you first no matter what. Even though that's not what they're doing, that's what they say they're doing. And they come at it so hard and so loud that people who are afraid say, yeah, that's what we want. We want someone to put us first. Put me
Mhm.
first. It's about me. I want things. I need things.
Right. America
Instead of
first is sort of that
instead of
message,
being
right?
about, yeah, and this whole idea of America first. Well, I'm an American, so I should come first. Yeah, well, I'm an American too, and you don't think that I should exist. So,
Mhm.
is it really America first, or is it you and what you think and believe in first? The message is so convoluted, but it's so easy to get behind if you agree with any of those types of policies, because you could have just one good idea, one good message, and so many people will buy in. And even if everything else is crap, they'll buy into that whole message of putting themselves first, even though it's coming from someone who doesn't give a damn about them.
Right. And I mean, why are Americans or anyone else better than someone else in the world too is sort of my thought process. Like I understand that we operate within our systems and there are borders within the world, and so there is to some extent this necessity to support people within those governmental systems. But to see Trump, for instance, cut off aid funding to people in need around the world, and everyone's cheering this on as if somehow that's a good thing, that there's going to be people suffering elsewhere in the world. I just don't understand that either.
I No, not everybody is cheering it on.
Mhm.
Uh, First off, there are
Well, yeah,
many
I shouldn't say everyone.
supporters. There are many of his supporters who cheer on this idea, but they don't actually understand what is happening. And you're finding that out from farmers who a lot of US aid is used to buy and supplement farmers in America to buy their food to send it overseas. And cutting off those grants and loans and funding from US aid is now affecting directly American farmers. And many small business farmers who depend on those resources are going to go out of business. And they didn't realize that was the plan all along because
Mhm.
they want those small farms to go out of business so that corporate buddies can come in and buy up their land and run their farms for them.
Right.
It's all part of the strategy, but they saw a president say, "We're going to put you first. We're going to put you first. We're going to take care of you." And they're doing the exact opposite. They're taking
Mm.
care of themselves and their own interests. And that's always what happens in any kind of populist government throughout history. Look, going back to the Roman Empire, the populist emperors, when they took control, it was all about their wealth, their glory, their success. When the Senate was in charge, senators rose up to try to take power. Any kind of government you look at throughout history, you see this connection of a populist message and movement always turning to bite the people who support it because they think that it's we're gonna take care of you, we're gonna take care of you. No, we're gonna take care of me is what the message really means. But
Right.
that's not what they're hearing, and that's not what they wanna hear. They wanna hear that we're gonna be taken care of, so they wanna believe in it so badly. And unfortunately, when they do, they have believed in something so strongly that it's hard for them to reject it even when it's hurting them.
Mhm.
Hard for them to swallow their own pride and say, "I was wrong."
Right.
And that's the whole thing around populism. The reason the Nazis were able to get in control back in 1930s is they were democratically elected. They took control through a populist message. They did three things. Said, "We are going to take care of you, and we're going to put you first, our nation, our people first. We're going to find a common enemy to dehumanize and put your anger behind and blame everything on. Let's find the common enemy. Let's dehumanize that enemy. Let's make them nothing more than common filth and trash." It's always
Mhm.
the message. It's always message. And then they build up their military, they declare war, and they try to take the territories of other nations behind this unified message of we are taking what's rightfully ours. This is ours. We want what's ours.
Right.
And and that's why populism and nationalism is so dangerous. It's okay to be patriotic and love your country. It's not okay to say my country can do no wrong and the people in charge of my country should be able to do whatever they want.
Right. And I mean, in a lot of these cases too, it's about pitting people against each other instead
Yeah.
of focusing on who the real problem is, right? These people at the top, it's saying, okay, your enemy is your next door neighbor who happens to be a minority. And I
Yeah.
know that as you talked about, people are struggling right now and they don't feel safe and they feel alone. And when you're speaking to those who feel that way, what would you tell them in terms of who to look for support and for allyship?
There are allies all around us. There are people who truly believe in the good of humanity. There are people who truly believe in helping people and taking care of others. It is so important for marginalized people to come together as a community because individually we can't win this fight, but together we can overcome anything. It's so important for us to unite together for the good of for the good of everyone. It's so important for us to uphold the idea that all human beings are inherently valuable, that all human beings are born with inalienable rights, that all human beings deserve dignity and respect, that all human being that life is valuable, that we should love our fellow human beings so much that we don't want them to suffer, not that we want them to suffer to feel better about our own failures and our own sufferings. We shouldn't want other people to be heard. My as an elected official, the mindset I have is very different from many other elected officials. I believe that elected officials should take two oaths of office, one to the constitutional duties, and a second one, the same oath that doctors take to do no harm.
Mm,
Government is
yeah,
not supposed to hurt people. Elected
mhm,
officials are not supposed to use their position to cause harm to others. As a matter of fact, they're supposed to use their position to help people, to help others. And there's a delicate balance on that because some things do hurt people, some things do help people. When I look at new legislation that comes across through the city, when I'm looking at new ordinances and new things that we're trying to do, the first question I ask myself on every single piece is, does this hurt people? Can
mhm,
this be used systematically to hurt people in the future? And if so, we need to fix that before we put this in place. I am very much against the sentiment of the greater good because the greater good has always been used to help the majority of people. But who's not in the majority? Marginalized communities are not in the majority. And
Right.
so marginalized communities get left out of that process. And they're the ones that always have those processes weaponized to hurt them even more. And that is a classical thing that's happened in government for years. It's why there's so much distrust in government from marginalized communities, is because marginalized communities and people have seen the government weaponized and used to attack them, even though those policies were supposed to be for the greater good and help more people. And in many cases, some of those policies do help a lot of people, but at the same time, they shouldn't be hurting others just because they're different. We need to look at governance through a lens that says, we're going to do this to help everybody, not hurt people. And if it's hurting people, we shouldn't do it. It's
Mhm.
time to look at ways to minimize harm. Government, my position as an elected official, I consider myself an elected official whose first priority is harm reduction. Harm reduction. I don't want to hurt people. That is never my intent. My intent is never to cause harm. I truly believe in compassion, education, and love. I believe that through compassion, truly caring about other people, sharing love with other people, and to teaching them and helping them learn and understand. That's how we build a better society where everyone can thrive. And I truly believe it is possible for everybody to thrive. People don't need to suffer for you to do better. Everyone has the ability to do better without causing other people to hurt and suffer.
Right. Well, and speaking of people hurting and suffering, I guess I should also be asking about the, I guess, a ban on abortions that is coming into effect in certain states around the U.S. With the repealing of Roe v. Wade, and um, it seems as though there is a very purposeful push to make those bans as harmful as possible, where in certain cases you go out of state and you get an abortion and then you're charged with murder, or you find children who are raped and they can't access an abortion and they're forced to carry a child to term, and the suffering that's involved in that. Why has the US gone that route? I mean, we have these debates about abortion in Canada, and a lot of times it just boils down to, well, that's never actually going to happen. We're never going to ban abortions. If you don't want an abortion, just don't get an abortion, kind of thing, right? It's a personal choice. But it's really become a hot button issue lately in the US in a way that I think shocks a lot of people and harms a lot of people as well, right?
Yes, no, it absolutely is harmful. These are Christian nationalists using their religious beliefs to try to influence a government and try to control how people live. What we are seeing in the federal government is the Project 2025 playbook. They said they were going to ignore it, but it's real, and they're
Right.
really implementing it, and they're really bringing in the people who wrote it to help implement it and help push it through. They were planning to do this the whole time. There are many states that are there are so many, and unfortunately the GOP has become this party, the Republican Party has become the party where extreme fundamentalist religious ideologues have commandeered their party and essentially become their policy wing of their party. And so all of their policy is justified by religious reasons. And they use that power of freedom of religion to say, not only should I be free to practice my own religion, which is what the First Amendment is, but they're also saying, because I believe in it, you have to do it too. And we're going to
Mm.
make laws that say you have to follow our religious laws, which is nothing more than Shira law. It's nothing more than what they've rallied against from Muslims and other religions for
The
so
the
long.
antithesis of, separation of church and state.
It is disturbing, it is disgusting, it is immoral, and I, for one, think that anyone who justifies making laws based on their religious beliefs truly doesn't value humanity or the freedom of others. And to those people, I will say, if God believes free will is good enough for humans, then I expect you to allow me to have my own free will, to make my own medical choices, to live my own life, not under your laws, not under your religion, but how I choose to live.
Right. Hmm. And I mean, I guess we're getting kind of close to the end of the questions that I have for you. But I do want to talk about climate change as well, which is more of a very broad issue that's going to affect people around the planet and is already affecting people around the planet. And the government in the US has said, we're going to pull out of all climate agreements and drill, baby, drill, right? We're just going to completely ignore climate action and, in fact, do the exact opposite, which is destroy the planet even more. So, how do we get to a point where we can address climate change if we can't get all countries on board? And I'm not just singling out the US. There's other countries that are like this as well. But here in Canada, we have a carbon tax, and we're arguing over whether or not we should have a carbon tax. But there's not a lot of argument about whether or not we should even act. It's just how we should act. And we recognize, at least most of us do, that we're one of the biggest polluters in the world when it comes to emissions per capita, for instance. And whether you think emissions should be calculated on a per capita basis or a country basis, there's significant harm being done by Canada, by the US, by other nations around the world. And if we're not cooperating with each other through these sorts of climate agreements that the US has now pulled out of, how do we ever fix the world to a point where we can, as a human society, continue to exist?
Well, that's a good question. And me personally, I think we've gone about climate change wrong from the beginning. Um, and the reason why Canada has a really high per capita rate of usage is because it's cold there for how much of the year?
Mm.
Y'all are basically frozen tundra. You need to use heating resources to stay warm and survive. You're going to
And we're
use
a
a
big
lot.
oil exporter.
Yeah, you're a lot you use a lot more of those types of resources than other nations do. I don't think we should punish people for using resources to stay warm and stay alive. But what I do think that the focus of this green initiative, the focus of climate change should be on the investment for new renewable energy sources. And personally, I think where many countries have gone wrong because they get scared is nuclear is the best clean energy option out there. Um, but it's not being used and utilized in the way that it could be. There are many nations. France is a great example of a nation that gets more nuclear energy than any other resource for the heating and electricity of its nation, and has done so in a pretty sustainable way. And I know there are a lot of fears about a nuclear plant going up or having issues with nuclear plants, which is why they should be extremely well regulated, maintained, and controlled. But I think nuclear energy is the cleanest solution out there to, at least right now. It won't be in the future. I think investment in new technologies and other technologies, we will find better alternative sources. But something like nuclear energy right now is very much a viable thing. And I think a lot of people get scared because of Fukushima and the unpredictability of natural disasters and things of that nature, which is why I also think you don't need huge, giant reactors. You make much smaller ones. It's something that they are working on technologies for in China. They're working on technologies for in the United Kingdom by building smaller nuclear reactors where if something ever did go wrong, it would be far less of an impact of something like a Chernobyl. And I think, Chernobyl scared people. I think Three Mile Island scared people. But nuclear energy is, for the most part, an extremely safe resource so long as it's well maintained and well regulated and people actually do what they're supposed to do, which is why it should be taken extremely seriously. But, you know, again, even if you say, well, nuclear is not the way to go, and I know a lot of people will say nuclear is not the way to go. Okay, that's fine. I get that. We don't want to use nuclear. Invest in something else. Find other sources. The cost of solar panel energy has come down rapidly over the past 20 years because of the investments and the improvements. However, there's still a lack of investment in storing solar energy. So you get solar energy when the sun's out, but how do you store it? And the cost of capacitors to store that energy is tremendous. So how do we bring down the costs of that? If we were working on these types of research and development and the resources that we were pulling in to find and hurt other people, if they were used directly for research and development so that they could find a solution, great, but they're not being used for that. You're
Mhm.
taking money from people and penalizing them, and then you're using it for your own whatever policy you want to push. It's not being used for research and development. It's not being used to actively fight against climate change by finding new alternative energy sources. It's being used for other things. It's being used to line politicians' pockets. It's being used to push other ideas, or it's being used for other programs. So I think, if you're going to put in a carbon tax, every single penny of that money should go into research and development for new
Mm.
sustainable energies so that you're actually, if you're going to fine people and say you're using too much, we're going to fine you for what you use. What else are they supposed to use? What
Mhm.
have you provided them so that they don't have to use it? You haven't. The fines. So put the money into new technology, new research and development. But me personally, I think the two things that heavily need investment over the next 10 years are nuclear energy and desalinization, because fresh water is soon going to be the next global crisis.
Right. And I think those are also sort of very location specific issues as well. So
Mhm.
here in BC, you will find a debate about whether nuclear is the way to go. And a lot of climate scientists will say, no, no, don't go nuclear. Um, in some locations, that might be the best way to go. In BC, we have a ton of, hydroelectric power. We can have wind and solar. We can have thermal. So there's a lot of other options that we can go with in order to avoid having to go with nuclear power. But in some places, they're not going to have those options. And same thing with desalinization. We have a lot of fresh water here in Canada. So that's not so much of a concern in most of our country in the way that it might be in other countries. And
Absolutely.
I think that that's a really good point that you make about investing in those energy solutions, right? Our carbon tax is not lining the pockets of politicians, it's going back to the people. So the average person is actually getting a rebate from those carbon taxes. But maybe it does make more sense to put that into um, i- finding avenues for new technologies. And one of the things that keeps coming up in our provincial elections is the fact that we're investing a huge amount of taxpayer dollars into subsidizing LNG and fracking instead of putting that money into renewable energy. And I think that that's another thing where we're just going the wrong direction. Why are we sort of propping up this dying industry when we could be propping up the industry of the future, which makes a lot more economic sense in terms of creating jobs and creating income for future generations?
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that work in those industries, so I understand the investment in it. But there should, at minimum, the rule should be for every dollar we put into that, we have to put into research and development for renewable energy to
Mhm.
find alternative energy sources. And of course, corporations and companies that work in those industries, they're going to fight that tooth and nail because one, they want every dollar for themselves, but two, they don't want competition. But what they don't, and you know what? Over the next 100 years, they won't have it. But guess what? Eventually, those resources dry up and they're not there anymore.
Mhm.
And then what do we do as a species? How do we continue to go on? How do we keep people? How do we keep people safe in the winter and heated? And how do we provide power and electricity? What's going to happen to society as a whole? So many people are short-sighted on their wants and needs now rather than the wants and needs of the generations that are going to come ahead of us. And we not only have to take care of the people here now, but make it a better place for the people who are going to be here after us. And
Mhm.
if we're not willing to do that, then what the hell are we doing?
Yeah. Well, and with that in mind, when it comes to thinking about how do you make the future better for people, or we've talked about U.S. Canada relations and the two countries specifically a lot throughout this conversation. What is your hope for the future?
My hope for the future is that people finally realize that violence and hatred are not the way forward, that they stall the progress of humanity, that they create an environment that makes everybody unhappy, that harms everybody, and that the only true way forward is to recognize the humanity of all people and treat them with dignity and learn to work together to lift everybody up. The ideal world I want to live in is one where we all support each other, encourage each other, love each other, find ways to make life better for each other. That's the world I want to live in. I've struggled in my entire life with so many things. I never want anyone else to hurt and struggle the way I have.
Hmm.
I want to see a world where that kind of suffering and that kind of hurt and that kind of struggle is a thing of the past. And we have the vast resources and ability to achieve that if we can get on board with that. But in order to get on board with that, it means accepting that people have the right to live their lives how they choose. And as long as they aren't hurting other people, let people live, let people be. You can disagree with them. You can not agree with their lifestyle, but you don't want to do it, don't do it. It's not for you, it's not for you. Don't try to control how other people live. Don't try to control how other people love. Don't try to control how other people feel, and don't try to push your own ideology and force other people to live the way you think is right.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I can't argue with that. I think that that's a really good vision for the future. I hope we get there at some point. It seems like, we're riding this roller coaster where sometimes it seems like we're on track to get there at some point, and other times it seems like we're moving backwards. But I hope in the end we end up on that trajectory. And is there anything else that we haven't discussed at this point that you think would be important to bring up before we start wrapping things up?
Yeah, I think that comes back to trans people, to you
Mhm.
and I, right? I think the conversation comes back to that. Let's go back to where we started. Um, let's dive in a little. The reason why this administration is dehumanizing and making trans people the enemy is because we are liberated. We are free. We are beyond the shackles that society demands that we live within, because we have decided to be our authentic selves and to do so in the most public way possible by being public and living our lives and finding happiness with who we are inside. And that means we're not controllable. We're not easily brainwashed because we've set ourselves free. And that's what makes us the enemy. The enemy of dictatorship is always free thinkers. And we are the most absolute free thinkers out there because we've rejected society's norms and said, hey, we're going to be ourselves no matter what. We're going to live authentically as ourselves. And I
Mhm.
always say, Shakespeare said it hundreds of years ago now. This above all to thine own self be true. That is the way. You should always, always be authentic and true to who you are. And if you allow society's expectations to shackle you and tell you who you're supposed to be or how you're supposed to live, you're going to find a hard time finding happiness in your life. And it's because of that you look to find happiness out of other people's misery and suffering, because you can't find genuine happiness for yourself because you're tied down to these society expectations of who you're supposed to be and you have to live up to them. And that just creates pressure. It creates this feeling of dread. It creates feelings of hostility and animosity, and that's why we have a society where we're at today. If people would just get rid of those expectations and say, I don't care if other people don't like who I am, I'm going to be authentically myself and I'm going to live my life for myself. For me, I think it would go a long way towards building that kind of society where people do build each other up rather than tear each other down.
Mhm.
Like, transgender people are probably the closest to that as a community because we have rejected society's expectations and we have said in a world that is dangerous in many places and getting continuously dangerous, more dangerous in this world. We have said we're going to be ourselves no matter what.
Mhm. And thinking about, these visions for the future and what we hope to see, what are your thoughts about what our audience can do to help get us there?
Yeah, it's really important to support people and support organizations that are doing the work. I always say if you're an ally, the most important thing you can do is show up. The second most important thing you can do is amplify the voice of somebody who is in the community. And the third thing that you can do is speak up. But
Hmm.
before you speak up, try to amplify the voices of people with the lived experience. Amplify their platforms, give them the opportunity to speak beyond on behalf of themselves, and stand right there by their sides while they're speaking. Open up those doors and avenues for them to speak. Now, if they can't be there to speak, then you speak up for them and you defend them and you stand with them. But show up, show up, show up, show up. We can't do it alone. We can't do it without you with us. And again, find the organizations doing the work that supports marginalized people, that supports trans people, that supports what you believe in. And again, don't forget to share love with people in general every day. Find someone and share an act of love, share an act of kindness, tell someone you care about them. It's so important now more than ever to be in touch with our own humanity and share that and be vulnerable and show appreciation and love for people who are in our lives because there's a big chance that they may not be there tomorrow. So we never knew when that time ends. So I try to, as much as I can, to share messages of positivity and love with people, and because I feel it's important for people to know that they are valued and cared about and respected and loved. Um, and so I randomly send messages to people all the time, and I'm sure I've done it to you.
You have, and I appreciate them every time.
And, it's kind of something I do because I want people to that's the world I wanna live in. So if that's the world I wanna live in, it's up to me to create it. So how do I create it? By doing it myself, by being the example. So be the example of the world you wanna live in. Work with people who are out there fighting for the rights and equality of all people. And please share as much love as you can while you can, because there's so many people, especially right now, who feel vulnerable, who feel insecure, who feel unsafe, who need extra love right now. And to all of Canada and all of the Canadian people, remember, as Americans, we're not your enemy. We love you. I love you. I wish nothing but the best for all people. I want to see you grow and thrive and succeed, and I hope that you would want the same for all of us. It is okay to hate governments, and thank you for taking a stand against ours in a time when they are being tyrannical. And I support that message 100%. But don't take your hostilities out on the American people themselves. Remember that we're humans too, that we are a shared continent of people, that we are, um, the American people and Canadian people are the closest of allies, even if our governments are being stupid. uh, we're still here on the same continent. We live in the same similar cultures, um, and we understand each other. We are brothers and sisters and siblings, and it's important to recognize that. So allow yourself to be mad and angry at the governments, but try to remember there are many American people who don't support what is happening, who don't support the administration, and who absolutely agree with you that the statements from this administration are nonsense, and that they're wrong. And so, um, know that. Please know that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing these messages and for joining the podcast today. It's been a pleasure to talk with you again. This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling. Today I've been joined by transgender politician from the US, Ashley Shade, for a conversation about a lot of different things. Thank you again.
You've been listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by Nicola Spurling on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples.